There is a moment, so small you could miss it if you blinked, that decides whether your day gets better or worse. It happens before you even notice it's happening. Someone cuts you off in traffic. A message comes in that reads harsher than it was probably meant. Your kid ignores you for the 5th time. A co-worker takes credit for something you built. And in that sliver of time, something in you either fires or it doesn't. Most people never even know that sliver exists. They think the insult and the reaction are the same event, glued together, inseparable, automatic, like a knee jerking when a doctor taps it with a little rubber hammer. Someone says something rude, and boom, you're already annoyed, already composing the comeback, already replaying it 3 hours later in the shower. It feels like there was no choice in the matter. It feels like the world reached into your chest and pulled a lever. Here's the strange, almost unbelievable claim the Stoics made over 2,000 years ago, a claim that modern psychology has spent the last few decades slowly, awkwardly, scientifically catching up to. That lever does not exist. Nobody reaches into your chest. There is no wire running directly from someone else's words to your emotional state. There is, instead, a gap, a space, a pause, however microscopic, between the thing that happens to you and the thing you do about it. And in that gap lives more freedom than most of us will ever use in a lifetime. This is not a small idea. This is arguably the single most practical piece of philosophy ever produced by human beings, and it was worked out by a former slave, an emperor who hated being emperor, and a Roman senator who wrote his best material while waiting to be told to kill himself. None of them lived easy lives. None of them were writing from a beach chair. They were writing from prison, from exile, from the middle of plagues and wars and political betrayals. And what they discovered, hammered out under real pressure, was this. You cannot always choose what happens to you, but you can, with practice, choose the space between what happens and what you do next. And that space, it turns out, is where your entire life actually takes place. Let's start with the problem, because the problem is bigger than most people realize, and it's worth sitting with it for a minute before we talk about the fix. Most of us are running on a kind of emotional autopilot that we never designed and never agreed to. Think about your last truly bad day. Not a tragic day, just a bad one. Maybe it started with an alarm that didn't go off. So you woke up rushed. Then the coffee spilled. Then a text came in from your boss that just said, "Can we talk?" when you get in with no other context, and your stomach dropped, and for the next 40 minutes you built an entire imaginary conversation in your head, a conversation that hadn't happened yet, might never happen the way you imagined, and yet you felt every bit of dread as if it were already real. Then you got to work, and the conversation turned out to be about scheduling a dentist appointment during company hours. Nothing. It was nothing. But you had already spent 40 minutes of your one, finite, irreplaceable life in a state of low-grade panic over a sentence that contained 0 actual threats. This is the water we swim in. We react to interpretations of events as if they were the events themselves. We react to imagined futures as if they were guaranteed. We react to other people's moods as if they were verdicts on our worth. And because this reacting happens so fast, faster than conscious thought, we mistake it for something unchangeable, something hardwired, something that is simply how we are. I get angry easily, we say, as if anger were a fixed trait like eye color, rather than a pattern that got reinforced 10,000 times because nobody ever showed us there was another option. The Stoics would say the confusion here is a confusion between two very different things: what happens and what we think about what happens. Epictetus, who spent years of his life enslaved before eventually becoming one of the most influential teachers in the ancient world, put this at the very center of his philosophy. He taught that events themselves are neutral. A neighbor's dog barking all night is not, in itself, an outrage. It is sound waves. A colleague getting promoted instead of you is not, in itself, an injustice. It is a fact about who holds which job title. What turns neutral events into injustices, humiliations, threats, and outrages is a judgment we immediately, almost invisibly, stack on top of them. And here is the part that changes everything. If you actually let it sink in, judgments are made by you, which means judgments can be examined by you, which means with practice, judgments can be changed by you. This doesn't mean pretending bad things are good, and it's worth being very clear about that, because this is where a lot of people misread Stoicism and think of the philosophy of suppression, of pretending you're fine when you're not, of stuffing everything down with a stiff upper lip. That is not what this is. Epictetus is not saying the barking dog makes no sound. He is saying that the leap from dog is barking to, I am owed a good night's sleep, and this dog is personally violating that right, and I am going to lie here fuming about it for 2 hours, is a leap you are making voluntarily, without noticing you're making it. And if you can notice the leap, you can choose not to take it, or at least choose to take a smaller, calmer one. Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor, wrote about this constantly in his private notebook, the collection we now call Meditations, which he never intended anyone else to read. This matters because it means what we're reading isn't propaganda or performance. It's a genuinely powerful man, arguably the most powerful man alive at the time, writing notes to himself at night, trying to talk himself down from irritation, trying to remind himself not to take the bait. Here was someone who could have anyone in the empire executed with a word, and he was still writing reminders to himself about not losing his temper with people who annoyed him. That should tell you something. Power does not remove the automatic reaction. Wealth does not remove it. Fame does not remove it. The reactive mind fires the same way whether you're an emperor or an intern. The only thing that changes, it is deliberate, repeated practice at noticing the gap. Marcus had a habit, recorded across many entries, of rehearsing his mornings before they happened. He would remind himself, before even getting out of bed, that he was likely to run into ungrateful people, arrogant people, people who would be unpleasant to him for no good reason. And rather than treating this as a reason to dread the day, he used it as a kind of psychological vaccination. If you already expect a co-worker to be curt with you, the curtness doesn't detonate anything in you when it arrives. It's not a surprise. It's not an ambush. It's just Tuesday. This is, if you think about it, one of the earliest documented uses of a technique that modern cognitive behavioral therapy still uses today, sometimes called anticipatory coping or stress inoculation. Marcus was doing CBT homework by candlelight nearly 2,000 years before it had a name or a diagnostic manual behind it. Seneca, the third major voice in this tradition, wrote something that I think cuts closest to the everyday experience most of us actually have, because Seneca was obsessed with anger specifically. He wrote an entire long essay simply called On Anger, and in it he makes an observation that is almost embarrassingly relatable if you've ever snapped at someone you love over something small. He noticed that anger, more than almost any other emotion, convinces you in the moment that it is not just justified but necessary. Anger doesn't feel like a choice while you're in it. It feels like the only rational response to an intolerable situation. That's the trick of it. That's why it's so dangerous. Fear announces itself as fear. Sadness announces itself as sadness. But anger disguises itself as clarity. It tells you, no, actually, I'm seeing this more clearly than I've seen anything all day, and the correct and righteous thing to do is act on this feeling right now. Seneca's entire argument is that this is almost never true, and that the feeling of righteous clarity is itself part of the emotional storm, not evidence that the storm has passed. So here we have 3 men, separated by decades and social status, converging on the same basic discovery. Between the stimulus, the thing that happens, and your response, the thing you do, there is a gap. In that gap is your judgment, your interpretation, your story about what the event means. And whoever controls that interpretation controls, in a very real sense, the actual emotional texture of their life, regardless of what is happening around them. Now, let's be honest about something, because I think it's important not to oversell this. Noticing the gap does not mean the gap feels big. For most people, most of the time, the gap between an insult and the urge to respond to it is genuinely tiny. It might be a fraction of a second. It is not some luxurious, spacious meadow where you get to calmly deliberate over tea. It is a crack in the sidewalk. But here's the thing about cracks. They can be widened. That's the entire practice. Stoicism is not a philosophy that claims you'll wake up one day with an enormous, permanent gap between stimulus and response, so large that nothing ever bothers you again. It's a philosophy that claims the gap can be widened session by session, day by day, the same way a muscle gets stronger through repeated, unglamorous use, not through a single dramatic transformation. Let's talk about how that widening actually happens in a normal, non-philosophical life, because this is where the ancient ideas need to meet the actual texture of a Tuesday afternoon. The first and most basic tool is naming the judgment out loud, even just inside your own head, the instant you feel the reactive heat start to rise. This sounds almost too simple to matter, but there's real psychological weight behind it. When you feel that flash of anger at a text message, most people's minds go straight from feeling to action. The mind doesn't say, I am having the thought that this message is disrespectful. It just acts as though the message is disrespectful. Full stop, no quotation marks around the claim. The Stoic move, and this shows up again and again in Epictetus' teaching, is to insert quotation marks instead of he's disrespecting me. You practice noticing I'm having the thought that this is disrespect. That tiny linguistic shift from a flat statement about reality to a labeled thought about reality is doing enormous work. It's the difference between being inside the ocean and standing on the shore watching the ocean. You're not denying the wave exists. You're just no longer underwater when it hits. There's a modern psychological term for something close to this called cognitive diffusion, used a lot in acceptance and commitment therapy, and it's essentially the same move dressed up in contemporary clinical language. The insight that a thought is not the same thing as a fact, and that you can observe a thought without being dragged along by it, is not new. Epictetus was teaching a version of it to Roman soldiers and administrators in the 1st century. The names change. The core discovery doesn't. The second tool, and this one is more physical, more embodied, is what you might call the pause of the body before the pause of the mind. Seneca actually recommended something wonderfully practical here, almost embarrassingly modern in how it reads. He suggested that when you feel anger building, you deliberately delay any action, even by a small amount, specifically because anger is a feeling that loses power the longer it's forced to wait. He noticed that people almost never regret waiting an hour before sending an angry letter, but they very often regret sending it immediately. This is essentially the ancient version of sleep on it, except Seneca is more precise than that folk wisdom usually gets. He's not just saying wait, because waiting is generally wise. He's making a specific claim about the physiology of anger, that it behaves like a fire that needs constant fuel, constant restoking through rehearsed grievance. And if you simply stop feeding it for even a short window, it naturally begins to shrink on its own, without you having to fight it directly. Try this the next time you feel your jaw tighten in response to something someone said. Instead of asking yourself, how do I want to respond? Ask yourself a smaller, more manageable question first. What would it look like to do nothing for the next 60 seconds? Not forever. Not let it go and never address it. Just 60 seconds. In practice, this is remarkably doable because 60 seconds does not feel like suppression. It feels like a short errand you're running for your future self. And what you'll often find, if you actually try this rather than just nod along with the idea, is that the version of you that exists 60 seconds later has noticeably more perspective than the version of you that existed in the original hot flash of reaction. Not because anything about the situation changed, because you gave your own judgment time to be examined rather than immediately obeyed. There's a story, often shared in Stoic circles, though it's more a teaching anecdote than a strictly verified historical event, about Marcus Aurelius receiving news of a serious military betrayal, a trusted general revolting against him, essentially attempting to seize the throne while Marcus was occupied elsewhere. This is about as close to a legitimate five-alarm crisis as a Roman emperor could face. Betrayal at that level, from someone inside his own command structure, is the kind of thing that would justify almost any emotional reaction, rage, panic, an immediate and merciless crackdown. And by most accounts of how Marcus approached this period, drawing on what we know of his general temperament from his writings, his instinct was not to erupt but to slow the moment down, to ask what a wise response would look like rather than what an emotionally satisfying one would look like. And there are records suggesting he even expressed a wish that the whole situation could be resolved without bloodshed, that the man might simply be talked into surrendering peacefully rather than executed as an example. Whether every detail of this story survives in perfect historical fidelity is less important than what it illustrates. The capacity to widen the gap doesn't just apply to minor daily irritations, to rude drivers and short texts. It scales up. The same muscle that lets you not snap at a slow cashier is, in a much more developed form, the same muscle that let a person under genuinely existential pressure choose deliberation over pure emotional discharge. This brings up something worth addressing directly, because it's the objection almost everyone raises the first time they encounter this idea. Doesn't this just turn you into someone who never gets appropriately angry? Isn't some anger justified? Isn't there something almost cold, even a little inhuman, about training yourself not to react? The Stoics actually have a sharper answer to this than people expect, and it's worth taking seriously rather than dismissing as ancient repression. The claim was never that you should feel nothing. The claim was that you should choose your response after clear-eyed judgment rather than during the fog of an automatic reaction, and that very often, the response you choose after a moment of clarity is different from, and usually more effective than, the one your nervous system wanted to fire off in the first half-second. Righteous anger at genuine injustice is not off the table. What's off the table is confusing the feeling of anger with the correctness of the action that feeling is demanding. You can still confront the co-worker who took credit for your work. You can still hold the line with someone who's mistreating you. But you do it after the gap has done its job, after you've separated this happen from, here's the story I immediately told myself about what it means and what I should do about it. The action that comes out the other side of that gap is very often firmer, more precise, and more effective than the one that would have come out in the first hot second, precisely because it isn't clouded by adrenaline and isn't trying to satisfy the short-term itch of feeling powerful in the moment. There's a particular kind of modern example that makes this concrete, and it's one almost everyone has lived through in some form. The group chat message or the email that lands wrong. You read it once, and your stomach tightens. You read it again, and you start drafting a reply in your head, and each mental draft gets a little sharper, a little more pointed, because you're rehearsing conversation as if the other person is already attacking you, so your mind is preparing a counterattack. This is one of the clearest modern illustrations of exactly what Epictetus was warning about 2,000 years ago. Just move from a marketplace in Rome to a phone screen in your pocket. The message is neutral. It's a string of words typed by a person you cannot see, whose tone you cannot hear, whose intentions you're guessing at entirely. And yet the emotional reaction feels every bit as real and immediate as if that person were standing in front of you shouting. The practical move here, the one that actually widens the gap in real time, is deceptively boring. Write the reply and then do not send it. Not yet. Let it sit for however long the situation allows, even if that's only a few minutes. Then reread it, not as the person who felt attacked, but as a slightly more restive version of yourself checking someone else's homework. Almost every time, that second read reveals at least one line that was less about the actual content of the disagreement and more about the heat of the original reaction, a jab, a bit of sarcasm, a phrase engineered to sting rather than to communicate. Cutting that line before sending is not weakness. It is, in the most literal Stoic sense, the entire practice. It's the gap, made visible, made into an editable document. Let's shift for a moment into philosophy proper, because there's a concept underneath all of this that deserves its own space, and it's one of the most quietly radical ideas in the entire Stoic system: the dichotomy of control. Epictetus opens his handbook, the Enchiridion, with what might be the single most consequential sentence in the entire Stoic tradition. He draws a hard line between things that are, in his words, up to us and things that are not. Our judgments, our impulses, our desires, our aversions, in short, everything that is genuinely our own doing, these are up to us. Our bodies, our possessions, our reputations, our positions in life, these belong to the category of things not up to us. Things that can be taken by circumstance, by other people, by simple bad luck, no matter how hard we try to protect them. Almost all human suffering, in Epictetus' diagnosis, comes from getting this categorization backwards. We treat things that are not up to us, another person's opinion of us, the outcome of an interview, whether a plane arrives on time, as if they were fully within our control, and then we suffer when they don't cooperate. Meanwhile, we neglect the one domain that actually is fully within our control, our own judgments and reactions, and let it run on autopilot instead of treating it like the one piece of real estate we genuinely own. This is not a small reframe. Think about how much of daily anxiety comes from trying to control the uncontrollable. Will they like me? Will the market go up? Will my kid make the team? Will this project be received well? None of these outcomes are fully up to you, no matter how much effort or worry you pour into them. What is up to you is the quality of your preparation, the honesty of your effort, and, crucially, how you interpret and respond to whatever outcome eventually arrives. The gap we've been talking about this whole time is not just a nice trick for staying calm in traffic. It is a literal physical location where the up-to-us portion of life actually happens. Every other part of existence can be influenced but never fully commanded. The gap is the one room in the house you actually own the deed to. This is why the Stoics were not, contrary to popular caricature, advocating for passivity or indifference to outcomes. Marcus Aurelius ran an empire. He didn't shrug at wars and plagues and say, "Not up to me, doesn't matter." He worked constantly, urgently, exhaustive of the things within his control, his own judgment, his own effort, his own responses to the people around him, while treating the eventual outcomes, success or failure, praise or blame, as genuinely secondary. This is a subtle but important distinction. The dichotomy of control is not an excuse to stop trying. It's a redirection of where your emotional investment goes. Put everything into your own judgment and effort. Hold outcomes with a slightly looser grip, because your grip on them was always somewhat illusory to begin with. Let's bring this back down to earth with something almost everyone deals with: waiting for a response after something important, a job application, a message to someone you're interested in, results from a doctor, a decision from a boss. The waiting itself is often more painful than whatever the actual outcome turns out to be. And the reason is almost always the same. We spend the waiting period running simulations, rehearsing outcomes, building emotional attachments to results we have no actual power over. The Stoic move isn't to stop caring about the outcome. It's to notice, honestly, which part of the situation is up to you, and to put your energy there instead. You already sent the application. You already said the honest thing. The waiting itself contains no further up-to-us content, except one thing: how you choose to occupy your mind during it. That, and only that, remains within your control. Recognizing this doesn't eliminate the discomfort of waiting, but it does something almost as valuable. It stops you from adding a second layer of suffering on top of the first, the suffering of fighting a fact you cannot change. There's a particular modern context where this entire discussion becomes almost unavoidably relevant, and it's worth naming directly: social media and the specific engineered nature of outrage online. Every major platform, whether by design or simply by the incentive structures that reward engagement, has become extraordinarily good at shrinking the gap between stimulus and response to nearly zero. A headline is crafted to produce an immediate emotional spike. A comment is engineered, sometimes by actual people trying to provoke you, and sometimes just by the flattening effect of text without tone, to read as more hostile than it might be intended. And the entire platform is built to reward the fastest, hottest reaction, the reply typed in 30 seconds of genuine anger, over a reply that would have been written after even 5 minutes of actual reflection. If you understand the Stoic framework, you can see the system for what it is: a machine specifically optimized to prevent the gap from existing at all. It's not an accident that the platforms encourage instant replies rather than delayed, considered ones. Outrage that has time to breathe often deflates. Outrage that gets an immediate outlet gets reinforced, rewarded with likes and replies, and taught to your nervous system as an effective, satisfying strategy, even when it corrodes your actual peace of mind and often your relationships and reputation along with it. The practical antidote here is almost laughably simple to describe and genuinely difficult to practice. Treat any strong emotional reaction to something you read online as information about your own judgment first, and only secondarily as information about the world. Before replying, before even fully forming an opinion, ask what you're actually being asked to believe by the immediate feeling. Am I being asked to believe the stranger's opinion has any real bearing on my life? Am I being asked to believe that responding right now, versus in an hour, versus not at all, will meaningfully change anything for the better? 9 times out of 10, when you actually ask these questions honestly, the answer deflates the urgency almost immediately. The content was designed to feel urgent. It usually isn't. Let's talk about relationships specifically for a moment, because this is where the gap matters most in terms of actual lived quality of life, more than career success, more than any online interaction. Almost every damaging thing said between people who love each other, the words that leave a mark long after the argument itself is forgotten, get said in the narrow window where the gap has collapsed to zero. Someone says something careless. The other person's nervous system floods before their conscious mind even catches up, and out comes a response built entirely from the heat of the moment rather than from what they actually believe or actually want for the relationship. Hours later, sometimes minutes later, they don't even fully recognize the person who said those words. "I don't know why I said that" is one of the most common sentences in human relationships, and it's essentially a confession that the gap collapsed entirely, that reaction and response fuse into a single, unexamined event. Widening the gap in close relationships doesn't require anything dramatic. It can be as simple as a single sentence you train yourself to say internally the moment you feel the heat rising during a disagreement with someone you love. I can respond to this in a way I'll still respect tomorrow, or I can respond to this in a way that feels satisfying for the next 10 seconds. Just holding that fork in the road in your mind, even briefly, is often enough to shift which path you take. Not always. Nobody bat 1,000 on this, including people who studied it for years. But even shifting the ratio, even turning 1 out of every 5 heated exchanges into a calmer one instead of an escalating one, changes the entire texture of a relationship over the span of years. I want to return to Marcus Aurelius one more time, because there's a specific entry in Meditations, paraphrased rather than quoted directly here, where he reminds himself that when someone wrongs him, his job is not primarily to punish them, but to understand what led them to act that way, since people generally act from a kind of confusion about what's actually good for them rather than from pure malice. This is a genuinely difficult idea to sit with, because it asks you to extend a kind of interpretive generosity to people even while you're still allowed to hold them accountable for what they did. It's not an excuse for bad behavior. It's a reframing of the emotional posture you bring to that bad behavior, one that tends to produce clearer thinking and better decisions than pure retaliatory heat ever does. Someone cutting you off in traffic is very rarely thinking about you at all. They're late, distracted, stressed about something in their own life you'll never know about. That doesn't make the cutoff less dangerous or less annoying. But recognizing that it almost certainly wasn't a personal attack against you specifically, that it was, in Marcus's language, a kind of confusion rather than malice, tends to shrink the emotional charge dramatically, simply because you're no longer treating a random event as a personal referendum on your worth. Let's talk about relationships specifically for a moment, because this is where the gap matters most in terms of actual lived quality of life, more than career success, more than any online interaction. Almost every damaging thing said between people who love each other, the words that leave a mark long after the argument itself is forgotten, get said in the narrow window where the gap has collapsed to zero. Someone says something careless. The other person's nervous system floods before their conscious mind even catches up, and out comes a response built entirely from the heat of the moment rather than from what they actually believe or actually want for the relationship. Hours later, sometimes minutes later, they don't even fully recognize the person who said those words. "I don't know why I said that" is one of the most common sentences in human relationships, and it's essentially a confession that the gap collapsed entirely, that reaction and response fuse into a single, unexamined event. Widening the gap in close relationships doesn't require anything dramatic. It can be as simple as a single sentence you train yourself to say internally the moment you feel the heat rising during a disagreement with someone you love. I can respond to this in a way I'll still respect tomorrow, or I can respond to this in a way that feels satisfying for the next 10 seconds. Just holding that fork in the road in your mind, even briefly, is often enough to shift which path you take. Not always. Nobody bat 1,000 on this, including people who studied it for years. But even shifting the ratio, even turning 1 out of every 5 heated exchanges into a calmer one instead of an escalating one, changes the entire texture of a relationship over the span of years. I want to return to Marcus Aurelius one more time, because there's a specific entry in Meditations, paraphrased rather than quoted directly here, where he reminds himself that when someone wrongs him, his job is not primarily to punish them, but to understand what led them to act that way, since people generally act from a kind of confusion about what's actually good for them rather than from pure malice. This is a genuinely difficult idea to sit with, because it asks you to extend a kind of interpretive generosity to people even while you're still allowed to hold them accountable for what they did. It's not an excuse for bad behavior. It's a reframing of the emotional posture you bring to that bad behavior, one that tends to produce clearer thinking and better decisions than pure retaliatory heat ever does. Someone cutting you off in traffic is very rarely thinking about you at all. They're late, distracted, stressed about something in their own life you'll never know about. That doesn't make the cutoff less dangerous or less annoying. But recognizing that it almost certainly wasn't a personal attack against you specifically, that it was, in Marcus's language, a kind of confusion rather than malice, tends to shrink the emotional charge dramatically, simply because you're no longer treating a random event as a personal referendum on your worth. Let's take one more real-world thread through this, because I think it's the clearest, most universal version of the whole idea: waiting rooms, delays, and the general experience of being at the mercy of a system you don't control. A flight gets delayed. A meeting runs long and pushes back everything else in your day. A website crashes right when you needed to submit something on time. In each of these cases, the actual practical damage caused by the event itself is often relatively small: an hour lost, a schedule reshuffled, a minor inconvenience in the scope of an entire life. But the emotional damage many people inflict on themselves in response can be enormous, entirely disproportionate to the actual stakes, precisely because the story they tell themselves in the gap turns "this is inconvenient" into "this is an outrage, this is unacceptable, this should not be happening to me." Notice the word should, doing a lot of quiet work there. It's a moral judgment smuggled into what is in reality a fact about a flight schedule. The Stoics would say the delay is not up to you. Whether you spend the delay steaming with resentment or reading a book or making a useful phone call, that is entirely up to you. And it is, not coincidentally, the only part of the entire situation that actually determines how you feel an hour from now. If there's a single takeaway to carry out of all of this, I think it's this. The space between what happens to you and what you do about it is not a fixed size. It is not something you either have or don't have, like height or eye color. It is a muscle, and like any muscle, it responds to use. Every single time you catch the reactive impulse before it fires, every time you name the judgment instead of obeying it instantly, every time you let 60 seconds pass before applying a message that made your stomach drop, you're doing a small rep in a gym that has no walls and no hours, a gym that is open at every single moment of your waking life, whether you choose to use it or not. Nobody does this perfectly. Marcus Aurelius, an emperor who spent his entire adult life writing reminders to himself about exactly this practice, was still writing those reminders on what was likely one of the last nights of his life, which tells you something important. This was not a problem he solved once and then moved past. It was a practice he returned to daily for decades because the automatic mind never fully stops firing. The goal was never to eliminate the reaction. The goal was to widen the gap, one deliberate pause at a time, until the space between what happens to you and what you do about it becomes, slowly, the actual home you live in, rather than a crack in the sidewalk you rarely even notice is there. That space is the only piece of the entire universe that was ever truly yours. Everything else, other people's opinions, the traffic, the market, the weather, the outcome of things you've already done, everything you could influence, all of that was always somewhat borrowed, somewhat on loan, subject to forces well beyond your control. But the gap, the pause, the room between stimulus and response, that belongs to you completely, and it always has, whether you've been using it or not. The Stoics didn't discover a trick for feeling better. They discovered the one piece of real estate every human being owns outright, and then spent their lives, under genuinely brutal circumstances, learning to actually live in it. Start small. The next time something small goes wrong today, someone's short with you, a plan falls through, a message lands wrong, don't try to fix your whole emotional life in that moment. Just notice the gap is there. That's it. That's the whole practice, at least at first. Notice that a fraction of a second exists between the event and your response, and that the fraction of a second is yours. Everything else, the calm, the wisdom, the better responses, those come later, built session by session, the same slow way any real strength gets built. But it starts with simply noticing the room exists at all. There's a reason this idea keeps resurfacing in slightly different clothing across so many different fields. And I think it's worth spending a little time on why, because it tells you something about how durable the discovery actually is. Modern neuroscience has a rough, imperfect, but genuinely useful way of describing what's happening in the body during that first automatic flash of reaction, a perceived threat, and it doesn't have to be a real threat, a tiger in the grass. It can just as easily be a curt email or a raised eyebrow. Triggers a fast, primitive response originating deep in the brain. Well, before the slower, more deliberate, more recently evolved parts of the brain have finished processing what actually happened. This is sometimes described loosely as the difference between an alarm system and a judge. The alarm system is fast, blunt, and built for speed rather than accuracy. Because for most of human evolutionary history, a fast wrong guess about a rustling bush was far less costly than a slow correct one. Better to jump back from every stick that might be a snake than to calmly verify each one and occasionally get bitten. But the modern world is not full of snakes in the grass nearly as often as it's full of ambiguous text messages, competitive co-workers, and mildly rude strangers, situations where the fast alarm system is almost always miscalibrated for the actual stakes involved. The judge, meanwhile, The slower part of the mind, capable of actual reasoning, context, and perspective, is perfectly capable of overriding the alarm, correcting its false positives, recognizing that the rustling bush is just wind. But the judge needs time to do its job. It cannot outrun the alarm. It can only be given a chance to weigh in before the alarm's verdict gets treated as final. This is essentially a scientific redescription of exactly what Epictetus was pointing at with his distinction between an event and a judgment. The alarm produces the raw sensation, the flash of heat, the tightening in the chest. But whether that raw sensation gets translated into a snap comment, a slammed door, an impulsive purchase, a scorched earth apply, or instead gets held, examined, and allowed to pass through a slower, wiser filter, that translation step is exactly the gap we've been discussing this entire time. 2,000 years separate Epictetus from a modern neuroscience lab, and yet they arrive from completely different starting points, at essentially the same architecture of the human mind. A fast alarm, a slower judge, and a crucial window of time in between where the outcome actually gets decided. Let's take a specific, very ordinary scenario and walk through it slowly, almost frame by frame, because I think seeing the mechanics up close is more useful than simply hearing the theory described in the abstract. Picture a fairly normal evening. You've had a long day. You get home hoping for something calm, and instead the person you live with, a partner or roommate, doesn't matter who, says something the moment you walk in that lands like criticism. Maybe it's about dishes left in the sink from this morning. Maybe it's phrased perfectly reasonably. Hey, can you actually deal with the dishes today? But you're tired, and your alarm system, already primed by a rough day, here's something closer to you're careless. You don't pull your weight. I'm disappointed in you. That interpretation happens in a fraction of a second, entirely below the level of conscious awareness. What you feel is not, I am interpreting this statement in a particular way. What you feel is simply, I am being attacked, full stop, as though it were a fact about the world rather than a story you just generated. Now, the next few seconds are where everything actually gets decided, and they happen so fast that most people never even realize a decision was made at all. In the version, without any gap, without any practice, the reactive mind fires immediately. A sharp reply, maybe sarcastic, maybe pointing out something the other person forgot to do recently, an attempt to even the emotional score as quickly as possible. This happens in under 2 seconds, and it happens with the full conviction of righteousness. Exactly as Seneca warned, it will not feel in that moment like an overreaction. It will feel like an entirely fair and appropriate response to being attacked. Now picture the same scenario, same tired evening, same comment about the dishes, but this time run through even a slightly widened gap. The alarm still fires. The tightening in the chest still happens. You don't get to skip that part, and Stoicism was never about skipping that part. But there's a beat, even just a second or two, where a quieter, more practiced voice gets a chance to speak before the mouth does. That voice doesn't need to say anything elaborate. It might just say internally, this is not actually as big as it feels right now, or I'm tired, and tired makes everything sound sharper than it is, or simply wait. And in that beat, the response that eventually comes out is different. Maybe it's just, yeah, sorry, I'll get to it in a few minutes. So without any real edge, because the extra second allowed the judge to catch up with the alarm and quietly overrule its verdict that this was an attack rather than a completely mundane request. The outcome of these two scenarios, over the span of a single evening, might not look dramatically different to an outside observer, but run the same fork in the road 1,000 times over the course of a year, in a relationship, in a friendship, in a job, and the two paths produce entirely different lives. One path produces a slow accumulation of resentment, both people walking on eggshells, every small request treated as a potential skirmish. The other produces something closer to actual trust, the sense that disagreements can happen without either person needing to brace for impact every time. The difference between those two outcomes was never really about the dishes. It was about a single, repeatable, learnable skill, the capacity to let a second or two pass between an alarm and an action. It's worth being honest that this practice gets dramatically harder under certain conditions, and naming those conditions is itself useful, because vague willpower advice tends to fail exactly where it's needed most. Fatigue shrinks the gap. Hunger shrinks the gap. Physical pain shrinks the gap. Genuine, cumulative stress, the kind that builds up over weeks rather than arriving in a single moment, shrinks the gap dramatically, to the point where even people who are normally quite good at this practice find themselves snapping over things that wouldn't have bothered them at all on a calmer week. This isn't a moral failing. It's closer to a simple resource problem. The slower, more deliberate part of mind, the judge, requires energy to operate, and when that energy is depleted by exhaustion or stress, the faster alarm system effectively wins by default, not because you're weak, but because the system that would normally intervene is running on empty. Knowing this changes the practice in a useful way, rather than treating every failure to widen the gap as evidence that the whole philosophy doesn't work or that you're simply bad at this. It becomes possible to treat certain periods of your life as higher risk zones, periods where you know in advance that your capacity for patience is thinner than usual, and to plan accordingly. This might mean warning people close to you that you're running on fumes this week, so a short reply isn't mistaken for genuine anger. It might mean deliberately avoiding decisions or difficult conversations during a stretch of bad sleep, not out of avoidance, but out of an honest recognition that the judge isn't currently well-staffed enough to do its job properly. Marcus Aurelius, notably, wrote some of his sharpest reminders to himself specifically during military campaigns, periods of genuine physical hardship and exhaustion, which suggests he understood this dynamic intimately. He wasn't writing reminders about patience during comfortable, well-rested periods of his life. He was writing them precisely because he knew the difficult periods were exactly when the gap tends to collapse, and that this was exactly when the reminder was most needed, not least. There's one more piece of this worth addressing, because it's the piece most people actually want once they've accepted the basic premise. How you actually build this skill, practically, on an ordinary week, without turning your entire existence into a philosophy seminar. The most reliable method, across basically every tradition that has studied this seriously, whether ancient Stoicism or modern contemplative psychology, is some form of regular, low-stakes rehearsal. This is why so many Stoic writers recommended a nightly review, a short period at the end of the day spent simply going back over what happened, without judgment, and noticing where the gap held and where it collapsed. Not to punish yourself for the moment it collapsed, that would defeat the entire purpose, but simply to notice, the way an athlete reviews game footage, not to feel bad about a missed shot, but to see the mechanics of what happened clearly enough to adjust next time. Seneca wrote about doing exactly this each night, going back over the day's events and asking himself plainly what he'd done well, what he'd done poorly, and where he might act differently given a second chance. This is not a punishing practice when done correctly. It's closer to simple, honest bookkeeping, the same unglamorous review of business does at the end of each month, not to feel guilty about expenses, but to actually see where the money went. Applied to the gap specifically, this might look like spending 2 or 3 minutes before bed thinking back over the day's friction points, the moment you snapped at a family member, the reply you sent too quickly, the small flash of irritation at a stranger, and simply asking, without harshness, where was the gap widest today, and where was it narrowest, and what was different between those two moments. Over weeks and months, this kind of review tends to surface patterns. Maybe you notice the gap collapses almost every time you're hungry. Maybe you notice it collapses specifically around one particular person, someone whose comments seem to bypass your usual patience entirely. Maybe you notice it collapses most often late at night, when you're tired and scrolling. These patterns, once seen clearly, become far easier to work with in a vague, general sense that you need to be more patient. You can't practice a vague, general trait very effectively. You can practice quite specifically. When I feel hungry and irritable, I will eat some before responding to anything important. And that specific, concrete practice is exactly the kind of small, repeatable rep that widens the gap over time. None of this requires becoming a different person. And I think that's worth saying plainly, because Stoicism sometimes gets marketed in its more modern, watered-down forms as a kind of total personality overhaul, a promise to become an unshakable, endlessly calm figure who never feels anything unpleasant again. That was never the actual claim, not from Epictetus, not from Marcus, not from Seneca. They were, each of them, still capable of frustration, still human, still occasionally caught by surprise by their own reactions. What they were describing was not the elimination of the alarm system, but the patient, ongoing cultivation of the pause that follows it, the deliberate strengthening of the judge's ability to weigh in before the alarm's verdict becomes final. That is a modest, achievable, entirely human goal, and it's also, when you actually live inside it for a while, one of the most quietly liberating discoveries available to anyone willing to put in the small, repeated, unglamorous work of noticing the gap day after day for as long as it takes.